about my research, which attempts to connect ideas of self-build housing, which we're obviously hearing quite a lot about over the past few years, normally connected to ideas of localism, and normally for people with maybe the time, the agency, the money to do that, to self-help housing, so self-help practices of housing. So looking at this idea of participation in housing with specific reference to how housing might be capacity building, and maybe empowering, although I'm very kind of hesitant to use that word actually, but particularly for low-income communities and people without a home, and particularly looking at this within a time of austerity as well. So that's the kind of context that I've been looking at it through. Obviously, when we've seen a 26% rise in homelessness between 2010 and 14, and we've obviously got a housing crisis different from north to south, but it's something that everyone's talking about, but there's very kind of little action on that. So I'm interested in how self-build can kind of be reframed as an educational tool, so to widen access to housing through participation, particularly for low-income groups. So how we might connect self-build up to problems of inequality, territorial stigmatisation, homelessness, generational unemployment and empty homes, particularly in the northeast as well, and so-called failing housing markets. And I find it quite strange this discourse is on the kind of peripheral of any discussion about self-build, because the 1970s community self-build movement was kind of a very kind of clearly working class self-provision movement on using land given by local authorities and often with mortgages provided by local authorities. And then the co-housing movement also had links to squatting and more kind of activist approaches as well. So I'm going to talk about this connection between self-build and self-help through a couple of different examples. A self-build housing project that is currently kind of live in the Oosburn area that I've been working on with Crisis and their members. So these are people that have been homeless, are homeless, or at risk of homelessness in Newcastle. But then we're kind of just evaluating that at the moment, so I'm going to kind of leave that to the second bit because, yeah, it's not right in the middle of it at the minute, so it's difficult to speak too much about the effects of that, I suppose. But also I'm going to talk a little bit about where some of these ideas of self-build, and particularly it has links to the ideas of self-governance as well, came from for me, and that was in looking at informal housing in Albania. So as part of my PhD, I was looking at what we could learn from the informal situation of housing for self-built housing practice and self-help housing practice in the UK. So just briefly, so this is a map of the informal housing settlements in Albania, in Tirana, which is the capital city in Albania. So 55% of all housing is considered informal or extra-legal in some way. So I was working in a settlement just on the top left-hand side there called Bathora. And I guess people came to the outskirts and settled here after communism, mainly from the mountainous areas in the north of the country, and came for opportunities, education, healthcare, because they'd kind of been left up there really with lack of resources and services really after communism. And this was the area that I was working in. Obviously it expanded massively during this period. It's even bigger than that now. And this is really, I guess, a city built by people. Just about every single family built their own homes here. So there's a huge amount of knowledge about self-build in this neighbourhood. And then they've really kind of made claims on the government as they've grown really for recognition. And they've now got their own town council. They have schools and hospitals and all the things that you would have in a kind of normal neighbourhood, really. And so what I was kind of looking at wasn't just the kind of process of self-build, the physical process, but also looking at how social ties were formed through this process as well. So just briefly, this is kind of an example of how people build really, really incrementally. So always like testing the authorities all the time to see whether they're going to come and bulldoze their place down. Mm-hmm. Most people don't live in a house like this. So most people live in a kind of model like this. And they kind of, the houses grow as families change, as people get more money, as they receive remittances from abroad, for example. But what's particularly interesting was that I studied the role of CoPlan, who were a local planning NGO who worked in collaboration with the residents to upgrade the settlement. So it's not legalised. They kind of foreground this idea of CoPlan, foreground this idea of that it needs to be upgraded before there's any kind of legalisation process that happens. And they developed a model of community-led upgrading, which not only included the provision of infrastructure, so that's like the water, electricity, roads, sewage systems, and then they trained the residents up to do this themselves as well. But it also involved the kind of social and political transformation of the area. So they created like micro community organisations which still exist today to manage the project from the ground level. And they use this collaborative planning methodology. They were actually reading your book, Patsy, because they often cited it to me when we were talking about it. So it kind of encouraged this kind of community institutional collaboration. So recognising that knowledge is really kind of scattered. So there's this constant process of collaboration and learning must occur kind of between scales. And they made use of various kind of participatory planning methodologies and set up like a women's group and a youth group as well. So CoPlan really acted as this kind of intermediary between the local authority and between the residents as well. So I guess it kind of exemplifies how maybe an outside institution can activate a community. And this is what I was interested for our self-built housing project with Crisis. So Crisis kind of acting as this intermediary. So this is the project in Newcastle. So it's this. It's none of that. It's the shed in the bottom right-hand side. So I worked with Excite Architecture, who are also based in the Oosburn, and Tilt Joinery Services, to create this prototype. It is a prototype, I'm stressing that. And it opened in May, and it's still open until August. And it's there till August, and then it goes to the Oosburn farm, and they're going to use it as a woodwork training building. Basically, they work with people with learning difficulties. So it has a nice life after that really fits with the kind of ethics and the concerns of the project. So obviously it's not a house. This is an interior view. It's not a house in the kind of normal sense. It's more of we're using it as an exhibition or event space. It's used for various things, like we've had artist residencies in there, we've had a series of public forums, we've had performances, we had the town meeting on Saturday, which you're going to be seeing in the afternoon today, and we've had a series of film screenings, all looking at the design build process, but also looking at some of the issues that have emerged from the project to do with housing issues, homelessness, the politics of land and development, because that's key to homelessness, but also looking at participatory alternatives as well. So the aim is not to create this kind of full housing model with all the services, the electricity and water. We run the electricity from a generator in the boot of someone's car normally, but it's to offer a kind of vision of what you can do. Basically, we put this up in 12 days, and it costs $6,000. So it's just to show what you can do. It's kind of a test, really. So here's just, in terms of the process, working with the group at Crisis have quite a big woodwork shop. So they focus on training and education, that's what they do. And so we worked with members of Crisis. So there's probably about 15 that came in and out of the project, and then 7 core members that stayed for 3.5 months. So the first 3 months was working with them 2 half days a week in the woodwork shop, teaching them woodwork skills. They did qualifications as well. Some of them had never picked up a saw before. But also we looked at different design skills as well. So we taught them SketchUp as well. So this is us kind of testing out the method of building, raising the frames. And also this process, I mean, when I think back to it now, I actually realised that in those sessions we were probably only working as in building, because we built parts of it in the workshop. We're only probably building for about half a session in each of the sessions, and that's probably because the rest of the session was just chatting and like getting to know each other, gelling as a group, and talking about issues, because people have a lot of problems, and so talking about housing issues or kids or health problems or benefits problems, and that was really, really important, not to just push it constantly like going, come on, we've got to get back to work, but actually make sure you use that time to build trust. I think that's absolutely key. It's totally key, particularly when you're like working in situations when people have extremely kind of complex lives as well. So it was almost kind of therapeutic in that sense as well. And we used, it's just a learning sketch up there. So this is the design for it that was done by Excite. We actually changed quite a bit of it as well, which was good for the members to be involved in changing some of the design aspects. We vaguely used this method of building, which is specifically designed for untrained self-builders. So this kind of shows you the process of that. So it's timber frame. There's no kind of wet trades involved that might require more enhanced training. You can build just using very simple tools. That was the key, is to just be doing it very, very simply as possibly. So just kind of with a saw, drill, hammer, that kind of thing. And it's built on this dimensional grid frame as well. So there's all the load sits within these posts, meaning that it's quite flexible because you can move room formations around quite easily. And then it makes use of these standard material sizes. So there's less cutting, less waste involved in it. And that's a picture of us. We went onto site for 2 weeks, as I said, and constructed it. I'll just quickly go through some images, really. So that's us putting the frame up. So we raised the frames like collectively, putting the flooring in. And on site we worked with 3 joiners and then the group. The walls. The roof, which ended up being ridiculously complex. I don't know why we had that pitched roof, but it looks nice now. And so there you can see the dimensional frame, and then that's us kind of doing it. But I'm putting the roof on there. So I guess with the project, I mean, that's just the outside. So I guess with the project, it's in terms of learning from this kind of illegal approach to self-construction. What I've found is that we've become quite removed from housing processes, really, and the autonomy in housing that they offer, and we've kind of got less choice than they do. And also, particularly in looking at it through an austerity context, obviously when our welfare state changes, there's not a lot to fall back on. We can't build, and like many of our members end up on the streets. Homelessness now is, particularly new homelessness, is not so much about some of the core issues that you previously associate homelessness with, which is interesting. It's more to do with welfare changes. So I think it's interesting to look at these kind of maybe more unlikely places, because it might tell us more about building on a shoestring, or about new housing typologies, or also building for kind of flexible or changing demographics as well. And I just want to stress this thing about autonomy. I think it's really, really key, and it's been key to the project as well. My work's been quite heavily influenced by the anarchist social commentator Ivan Illich. He talks a lot about control and autonomy, and he uses the example of the building industry and planning and building control, which he says are imposed on societies, which therefore modernise the poverty of citizens. And I think it's really key, actually. And it reduces opportunities for self-help and self-build strategies. So it's kind of prescribing certain ways that houses must be built. It creates this rising scarcity of housing. And he says, I'm just quoting him here, that this has happened all over the world, and at the same time housing has been discovered as a major problem. The technological capability to produce tools and materials that favour self-building has increased, but social arrangements like codes, unions, mortgage rules, markets have turned against this choice. So I think although the project kind of has self-governance at its edges, it's not really about that per se. It's about ideas of participation and collaboration and learning, particularly. And it's something that I witnessed in Albania. But I think because of the complex needs, and Dave flagged this up actually when you were talking about self-help before, because of the complex needs of the group, you need this mediator that like Crisis acted as, or that planning NGO acted as in Albania. Because these people's lives, particularly in the case of our group, they're so tied to what it is, the benefit system or the local authority, or organisations like Crisis. But it's about these organisations acting more as kind of enablers, I guess, to groups and communities. And I think there's important things that I've learned through this, and I know that I haven't, it's not been evaluated properly now, but I guess for me it's again this looking at this using multiple scales of governance. So, and looking at the roles that each actor kind of plays in that, from the members to the project management team to crisis, to funders as well, that's core, and local government. And it's really important that it's kind of visible to local government as well. So this is a picture of our members presenting the group at a forum event on self-build. So that was really important as well, that they then go on to talk about it and become advocates for it is really, really important. And then the council are running a couple of workshops to extend their learning on self-build strategies, but also how you might start to evidence social impact for self-build housing projects as well. So it's really key that it does have that focus as well. And it's also about breaking the professional boundaries down, and that's why we used the specific model of building that we used that was specifically for untrained self-builders. So it's using these professionals almost as kind of enablers, so the architect and the joiners that we worked with as enablers for the group. And actually in the end, the group actually started teaching each other. There was a point at which in the project we took a kind of step back, and then they kind of just started working with each other and teaching each other. And again, I think, this is not a big project, it's a drop in the ocean, it's tiny, but I think it's about starting doing and testing things really incrementally and seeing whether they work. And yeah, starting small, really. I think that's what it's about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We are running late, but we'll see whether we can manage the